Good afternoon and welcome to our session today. I'm very delighted to see you here on a very, very hot day. And I should say, if any of you want to take your jackets off, I'm sure our speaker wouldn't mind. So feel free to do that if you find you're overheating. A very warm welcome to our speaker today, Sir David Omand, who is well known to many of you here, thanks to his very distinguished service in government over the years. He's held various offices, and I will come to those when I introduce him more fully. Anyway, I'm delighted to see him here today in person. The last time you spoke to GSF, it was remote. And so today we have the benefit of your physical presence here, so we can aim our questions at you after you've spoken. Can I just, before I get on to the introduction, just alert you to our next event. It's a morning seminar entitled After Turkey's Elections, A Change of Direction or More of the Same. And we are co-hosting this with the Southeast European Studies at Oxford, which goes by the acronym of CSOX. They're based in St Anthony's College, and this event will be the 10th anniversary of our annual collaboration with them. The seminar will take place here in this room at 10:30 to noon. Invitations have been sent out so that you will be able to let Jacqueline know if you'd like to attend. And I hope that many of you do. I think it'll be a very interesting session given what's happening in Turkey at the moment. Turning to today, the format for today's event is, as we've done before, a hybrid event, one with remote and in-person audience. For those attending the event remotely via Zoom, it's a view only. For any remote audience members who would like to ask a question, please submit it in writing through the Q&A function, and I will be alerted to the question, and if we can fit it in, I certainly will. For those here in person, please, if I call you, give your name when I call you, and please wait for the microphone to come to you. Again, because this is a hybrid event, it's very important your question is heard over a microphone, otherwise the session stops making sense to those who aren't in the room. Turning to today, I'm delighted, as I say, to welcome Sir David Omand, GCB. He's a visiting professor in the War Studies Department at King's College London, where he teaches intelligence studies. He's been a vice president of RUSI and is now a distinguished fellow. His posts in government service included United Kingdom Security and Intelligence Coordinator, Permanent Secretary at the Home Office, and Director of GCHQ, the UK's Signal Intelligence and Cybersecurity Organisation. So he has a very broad wealth of experience, and particularly in the matters he's going to talk to us about today. He has written various books: Securing the State, which was published in 2010, Principal Spying, the Ethics of Secret Intelligence, which was published in 2018, and How Spies Think, 10 Lessons in Intelligence, which was published in 2020. His most recent book, which is here beside me on the platform, is called How to Survive a Crisis, Lessons in Resilience and Avoiding Disaster. It was published on the 1st of June, so it's very, very fresh off the press, and this is what he's going to be talking to us about today. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here today, David. How to Survive a Crisis is, I'm told, because I haven't yet had the chance to read it, an excellent book full of insight and practical advice drawn from your experience, both at the highest levels of government service and indeed in academia as well. It's also a very good read, I'm told, and I encourage all of you to buy a copy if you haven't done so already. And in fact, I'm sure that David, if you do, would be happy to sign it. David's going to talk to us today about the nature of modern crises, how they develop, how to handle them, and crucially, how to avoid losing control of events and a disaster unfolding as a result. I think that's very topical at the moment, so I'm delighted he's here with us today. We seem to be moving from one crisis to another, both internationally and domestically, so the benefit of his wisdom will be very well received. I'm very much looking forward to hearing you speak on how to manage this. In fact, the timelines of our two careers are such that a number of crises, which I'm told you have covered in the book, have been ones in which I've marginally been involved in ministerial circles, and I'm very keen to hear what you have to say. You'll give your opening presentation on how to survive a crisis for about 20 minutes, and then you and I may have a short conversation, number of short questions, and then I would open it to the audience with the intention, as usual, of closing on the dot of 2 o'clock. So I have nothing more to say, except, David, to ask you to address us.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for that introduction. When a book appears that you've written, there's a combination of feelings of relief that finally it's out, and trepidation about people might actually read it, and what would they think of it. Just to let you into a little secret, Penguin have done a very good job of production, and there's some very nice end papers. There's a hidden enciphered message from me in a Python string, for those who know what these things are, in the end papers, and I wish you luck if you want to try your hand with that. Now, there's no shortage of material, raw material, for writing about crisis. The pandemic, the energy crisis, the disruptions to supply chains, the microchip disruptions. We had a catastrophic Turkish earthquake, 2 recent bank failures, extreme weather events, floods, drought, famine all around the world, and escalating cyber attacks against our institutions and businesses. All the familiar terrorist threats are still there, and disputes and conflict internationally. I probably missed something off the list, but hovering over it just at this moment, which makes this rather timely moment, is, of course, the growing US-China confrontation, and over China's military assertiveness, particularly over Taiwan, and the real risk of a fatal collision, a fatal accident in the air or at sea, which would suddenly precipitate a crisis. I took note when one of the bellwethers kind of rang, which was Warren Buffett, who made public that he had finished pulling out his $4 billion stake in TSMC in Taiwan, the only fab that is capable of making the 2 and 3 nanometer chips on which future AI and future defense systems will depend. So he said it was a great company, but too dangerous a location for his investment. That's the kind of phrase we should just reflect on. Now, I've used the word crisis. What do I mean? I mean that period of time when challenging events hit you with a speed and an intensity faster than your normal processes can cope with. So it's out of your control, you've lost control. And we all know just how psychologically disturbing a condition it is when somebody feels they've lost control of the situation. New problems keep arising, and the situation threatens to spiral out of control. And in the book, I describe what I call the rubber levers test, because the klaxons sound, the alarms go off, levers are pulled, and the levers appear not to be connected to the real world, and the crisis continues or deepens. And when that happens, it is deeply disturbing for the individual or family, it's deeply disturbing for organizations in public and private sectors, and indeed when it happens at a national level. I've, in my career, which you referred to kindly, Michael, I've several times seen in close-up British governments swept from office by their inability to survive a crisis, principally because of their inability to keep public confidence that they can regain control. I was in a couple of anecdotes. I was in the Defence Private Office in 1973 when Junior Private Secretary to Peter Carrington, when the Heath government, you'll remember, was kicked out over the energy crisis and the 3-day week. Some of you will remember the 3-day week. I was, and my colleagues, we were in the private office by candlelight on the nights when the power was turned off. We were anxiously scanning the bulletins coming from the Civil Contingencies Unit in the Cabinet Office, reporting on the coal stocks at the power stations and how they were gradually going down. Then some bright spark decided perhaps we should go and look at the coal stocks. And they did, and they found the bottom third was waterlogged and couldn't be burnt. So the Heath government, literally as well as figuratively, ran out of energy. They subsequently, of course, lost narrowly, but lost the following election. The 1979, I rejoined the Defence Private Office, and Fred Mulley very genially welcomed me and said, but I don't think we'll be working together for very long, because, do you remember the winter of discontent? The government was in real difficulty. The strike of local government workers meant that London streets were filling up with black bin bags of rubbish. Rather like Paris has been through this experience recently, which is very disconcerting. But more disconcerting for the public opinion was the strike of gravediggers. So the dead were unburied. Into this flies Jim Callan, back from a very successful summit in Guadeloupe, sunny Guadeloupe, where he'd been obviously swimming and allowed himself to be photographed swimming. And against the direct advice of the number 10 press office, this is on record, he said, I'll meet the journalists at Heathrow. So he met them. And the next day's Sun newspaper, crisis, question mark, what crisis, question mark. And poor Jim Callan never recovered from that. And his government was, of course, swept away by Margaret Thatcher. So those are a couple of examples where what's really important is the confidence. And if I transferred this to the private sector, it would be confidence of investors when trouble comes along. Can you keep that? I'll also give an anecdote of a crisis I saw at close quarters, which didn't result in the defenestration of the government. And that was in 1982. And I was the principal private secretary to John Nott, the Defence Secretary, working in his room in the House of Commons. A runner arrives from Defence Intelligence with 3 deciphered Argentine naval signals, which had only one meaning, that the Argentine junta had already sent their task force to the Falklands, towards the Falklands, and there was no way of stopping them. So John and I realized this is existential for the government. We rushed down the corridor, we burst in on Margaret Thatcher. I'll never forget, she read them and instantly saw their import and looked at them and said, this is very serious, isn't it? To which there is only one answer, yes, Prime Minister. It was great that GCHQ could decipher these. This is now public record, by the way. It's not classified information. But it was too late to stop the invasion. It was too late to get reinforcements there. But what it did, crucially, was to give the Prime Minister 2-3 days' notice. And that was enough for the idea of sending a task force to the South Atlantic to germinate, become real. And on the Saturday, I remember the debate in the House of Commons vividly. On the Saturday, she stood up and announced with determination that the task force was already preparing for sea. And that, and the principled resignation of Peter Carrington, Foreign Secretary, was enough to satisfy her backbenchers, who otherwise, I am quite sure, would have had her head. So that's a point we might discuss, which is about confidence. are you going to be able to get beyond the crisis period into something that I describe as an emergency? But it's not really a crisis. The cynics, maybe some amongst you, would say, crisis management is an oxymoron. You don't manage a crisis manages you. I take a more nuanced view in the book, and I distinguish between emergencies, crises, and disasters. And the picture I invite you to have in your mind is that the crisis is delicately poised between, on the one hand, being forced over to be an emergency where there are capabilities, emergency services, plans, there's been some rehearsal and so on, and it becomes something that's in control, although extremely unpleasant and difficult, but it's still back in control, and tipping the other way into disaster. And what makes the difference, patently, is whether we have anticipated the kind of problem that could arise, and we've taken some practical steps to prepare ourselves. That the emergency services are equipped, that we've done the right kind of rehearsals of different times, contingencies. And so with a bit of improvisation, because it will never be exactly as the plans would have laid out, with a bit of improvisation, you can get through. And if you have this strategic notice of the kinds of problems, and I gave a long list when I started my remarks of crises that are coming, or some already here, then you can consider how to build up the resilience at the individual level, at the corporate level or organizational level, and at the national level. In the book, I distinguish between two kinds of crises. I mean, it's not a perfect distinction, but it's useful. One is the sudden impact. Out of a blue sky, bang, something has happened. And you have to deal with that with what you've got to hand. And if you haven't made the preparations, too bad, it's going to be tough. The other is the slow burn crisis. And those are the ones that I think are the most dangerous, because by definition, the crisis has been creeping up on you year on year. It's all been getting worse year on year. And at some point, it happens. And it may, by then, be in a situation which is almost irrecoverable because it's been allowed to fester. If we take the tragedy of Grenfell Tower, a very painful event for all of those involved, it's now been revealed in the inquiries that for years, building regulations were not properly enforced, tests on flammable materials were not properly conducted, and there was nobody really looking at the problem of year on year, more and more high-rise buildings being clad in material that, with bad luck, could turn into a disaster. So that's a classic example of the slow burn crisis, that it only requires a bit of bad luck that it will happen. And for those involved at the time, you can, a criticism would be they're trusting to luck, that it's not going to happen on their watch. And so many of these crises are of the nature that it never seems the right time, or there's never the budgetary headroom or the political circumstance to actually grab it before it's worsened to a point. Now, to be provocative, I might say junior doctors' pay. They're on strike today, I think, or tomorrow. It's a classic example. Year on year, for over a decade, the gap between money wages and real wages got wider. It was never redressed. And it could never be redressed in one go anyway, too expensive. But it was just left. And so it seems obvious that at some point tempers would fray, patience would run out, there would be industrial action, and us, the potential patients, would be affected. So for government, and the same is true of companies, I spent 12 years on the board of a PLC, you can see things aren't quite right over here. Is it the right moment to pull it up and say, look, let's get rid of this subsidiary, it's not working, or this expansion into some new overseas business operation. So the same factors are there. In the political world, I think there's an additional factor, but to some extent I've also seen it in the corporate world, because again, almost by definition, the slow burn crisis, something is not right. But to do something about it requires the chief executive or the chair or the secretary of state to acknowledge the thing that's not right is their cherished policy. It was their decision to move into a new venture overseas. And now they're going to have to eat those words and say, well, it didn't work, let's actually... And the same is true, I think, in the political world. So my point here is about the difficulty of getting recognition that corrective action has to be taken early enough before the whole thing becomes unmanageable. I won't go on, but it's worth discussing what, within a corporate setting or within a government, what capability would you need to give confidence that the very private, very trusting discussions are taking place between the experts, the advisors, the civil servants, and the ministers, so that you recognize some of these things before they explode. So, to conclude with what I suppose the overall resilience message of the book, 3 points. Not every unexpected disruption in our lives deserves the label crisis, even if the media would like to stamp it. Not every genuine emergency situation need become a crisis, provided we've done some anticipation and done some investment and identified our vulnerabilities. And even where you do have a genuine crisis, it doesn't have to tip into failure and disaster if, over the years, we have built up individual, corporate, and national resilience. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. That, David, was fascinating, and a lot of thoughts came into my mind of various things that I've lived through and wondering whether they were crises or not in the end. Can I just ask a couple of questions? The first is on an international scale. I mean, the big crisis at the moment, I would have thought, was Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. Do you regard that as a slow burn crisis?
Shall I send it?
Which I think is arguable.
I'm sorry, I'm going to shut this off. It's speaking to me. ChatGPT is interpreting your question.
Very interesting. I hope it's GBT and not GCHQ.
You don't need to worry about GCHQ. If it's the SVR, you probably do.
What I was wondering, if you look at Ukraine, that in a sense could be argued was a slow burn crisis. It's been coming a long time in terms of what Russia and Putin might do. But equally, when it happened, it was a sudden impact crisis. And I wonder whether, looking back, you can distinguish between those two in this respect, and whether there were things we should have done before it became a sudden impact crisis which might have averted it.
I think the way I describe it is that the slow burn potential crises get worse. And at some point, they're probably going to blow up. And that's the point which we saw last February, when you get to that invasion, which, as a general rule, the sudden impact stuff, you very rarely know exactly when it's going to happen. But you know it's very likely to. You can put a probability on it. And as the years go by and the San Andreas Fault has not widened and opened and destroyed California, you begin to get more and more worried that at some point something like that might happen. So in the case of Ukraine, we can look back and we can see that the purported settlements between the West and Russia had not really stuck, and that Putin's mind was very clearly, did not accept the settlement. He didn't accept the independence of Ukraine, far less that it would gravitate to the European Union or indeed to NATO. Then comes, the first 2014. Does the West respond robustly and firmly to remind him of no, we don't. Seen from Moscow, although from our point of view, of course there were diplomatic responses and sanctions and so on, but from his point of view, he would have said, actually, when the time is right, I can finish this, which he attempted to do very, very badly, but he did attempt to do. So I think it kind of illustrates that in a lot of areas, you can see the trouble brewing. If you intervene at the earlier stage, say in 2014, more robustly, send the right kind of deterrent messages and so on, you might just have a chance. With Putin, perhaps not, but it wasn't tried.
On a totally different matter, but one thing which I suppose sticks in the back of my mind at the moment is artificial intelligence. We read about it all the time. We're told it could even extinguish mankind, or whatever the phrase is. How should we be approaching that? Is that a slow burn, or is it a sudden impact? Potential.
It's a slow burn which we are being panicked into thinking is a sudden impact. Would be my sort of shorthand way of putting it. I mean, the one thing about artificial intelligence is it's not intelligent. It really, really isn't. It's a neural network, and these neural networks don't think. They calculate. And it's spectacular. It's an amazing technological feat that GPT-4 can give any of my students at King's College, a 10,000-word essay, and they can churn it out. And some of it will be right, some of it will be wrong. The very fact it can be done. But the slow burn part is that this technology is extraordinarily useful, both to business, to finance. It's already in use in finance for fraud detection, for example, and to government. So bit by bit, we will see all sorts of government services and the allocation of benefits, the operation of the borders, all of that will have AI baked into it. It doesn't mean it will be autonomous. It doesn't mean that officials are no longer necessary, but it does mean that their work will be heavily influenced by the fact that the machines have done the hard work. The analogy is cancer. The ability of the machine to distinguish between a benign and a malignant tumor is better than that of, I would hazard to say, all the consultants, but certainly all but the very, very best consultants. And therefore, that will be a huge benefit to patients and to the NHS, because it means that precious consultants' time will be spent on what are statistically the cases that really need that attention. We will find NHS services transformed in 10 years if we are prepared to invest in these systems. So I think we should. The discovery of new forms of material which we'll need for global warming and so on, dealing with all sorts of things, including replacing some of the energy-hungry materials inside our computers and IT systems. All of that, the ability to analyze protein folding, for example, so that a drug company isn't faced with, we'd have to try out 50,000 compounds to see whether any of them would be a new antibiotic. The machine will do that for you, and the company will have a selection of 10, where you can put real effort in. So it becomes affordable. So they actually might be investing in new classes of antibiotic. If they're faced with having the huge cost of clinical trials on 50 compounds, they won't do it. So in all sorts of ways, I'm an optimist about this. We will need some regulation, not the EU kind, which would simply stifle innovation, but we need sort of set of house. Let me offer you a thought. Isn't this the perfect example where the major parties should reach out to each other and instead of squabbling at the margins about its use in border control or whatever, should actually say, no, let's get a parliamentary consensus on the principles that, you know, a mature democracy like ourselves should actually apply, and then we can try and get other countries to sign up to them. If it becomes a party political football, then God help us.
It's a lovely thought. I'm not sure politics is quite grown up enough to do that yet.
We used to have royal commissions, but we kind of got out of the habit of those.
The trouble with royal commissions is they took too long.
Yeah,
And by the time they reported, everybody lost interest.
Technology would have moved on.
Yes. Very interesting. I think that the idea of artificial intelligence being a crisis is perhaps therefore overblown. And that's something we might take away from here. I'm now going to open it to the floor and to those who are coming in online. Gentleman over there. Yes, please, you.
Thank you very much. Nigel Hall. Can I turn to resilience, please?
Sorry, could you introduce yourself?
Nigel Hall. Can I turn to resilience, please? Do you agree we are one of the most just-in-time nations? And if you were National Security Advisor, would this concern you? And would you make it a priority for making urgent adjustments? Thank you.
Yes, I would agree. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was to try and make a difference, because underneath it all is actually a plea to actually invest in resilience against the kind of crises that are going to hit us over the next 10, 20 years. It won't be done overnight. It's a long-term business. And I think we're probably less resilient as a nation than we were 10 years ago. A number of reasons. The austerity following the great crash of 2007, cutbacks, Brexit, which diverted all the contingency planners for years into looking ahead to a no-deal Brexit, which had to be done. There was no alternative. Those plans had to be made. And our vulnerability. And that's the bit I think that, you don't have to read the book, but that's the bit that I think people haven't quite cottoned onto. We are much more vulnerable because so much of our life is now dependent on information systems. And these are inherently vulnerable. We know the Chinese have been all over our infrastructure. The Russians have too. They've been over the American infrastructure. So far, this is just a slow burn crisis. Come the day, we may find that quite a lot of our society doesn't work properly. We're vulnerable. I think the supply chain disruptions, both flowing from the war in Ukraine. Who knew that Ukraine has specialized in making the wiring harnesses for almost all modern motor cars? And you can't make a motor car without these. It's a very specialized business to make them. And when the war broke out, suddenly you found all the big auto manufacturers were having to put people on short time because the supply dried up. The Chinese COVID policy, lockdown policy, which shut Shanghai and other ports for a long period, suddenly all sorts of bits of industry. Now, is the answer to onshore or friendshore, take stuff out of China? That's kind of de-risking on I'm not an expert on China. But it seems to me that that could be taken to the point where it becomes just another reinforcer of Cold War 2.0 with China, which I really don't think is a good idea.
Very interesting, yeah. I've got an online question coming in. I will come back to you afterwards. From Madeleine Moon, who asks, does the failure to use officially recognised communication and recording systems add to the loss of trust and building of a crisis, such as the use of encrypted social media messaging systems by politicians to discuss policy?
I think, Madeleine, you may have WhatsApp in mind, but there are other systems. I was appalled when some of Matt Hancock's exchanges with senior politicians, with the cabinet secretary, came into the public domain. A, that they came into the public domain at all, but B, that serious life and death matters were being framed within a discussion medium like that. You know, obviously, you and your colleagues would have a cup of tea before a cabinet meeting and you would exchange your views pretty informally with each other. But this is different. This is the systematic communication between the major shapers of public policy using a very informal medium, very short messages. And whilst there may have not been decisions taken that way, so I think Matt Hancock has said, the way it will be very apparent. This is where groupthink starts to arise, when you get this flurry of WhatsApp messages. By the time the formal submission from the Director General of some policy department arrives, it's too late. The way in which it's interpreted has already been framed. I think it's a thoroughly bad idea. And of course it destroys the Public Record Act, because there's no record of this stuff. Indeed, some of it is automatically dialed up to disappear. So you have your chat and then it's vaporized. So we don't know. I think Lady Hallett is absolutely right to insist on seeing it all. That's why you had that kind of inquiry. If it's a point I've made on the media, that to say that some exchanges are irrelevant to the inquiry may be true in a very narrow sense, but she has to reach a judgment on what they were all doing at the time, including spending time worrying about other things. That's part of, it's one of the things that historians always get wrong when they describe some crisis like Suez. They forget that actually, 1956, you had the Hungarian uprising. There were other things occupying senior ministers. There would have been many other things occupying ministers and senior officials when COVID first arrived. So I think she's perfectly entitled. She could do it very quickly, just to scan through and see whether there is anything there that bears out what I suspect must be one of her hypotheses, that folk didn't focus on it fast enough.
Interesting. Yes, please. They're behind. Yeah.
John Wilson. Sir David, isn't the fundamental problem that this country is hubristic and manana? It will not face the facts, and therefore prophets in this land are not heeded.
Well, I don't think it's for me to answer that. The only answer is yes and no, isn't it? There are aspects where you cringe, and the last few years have been quite cringeworthy. But there are other aspects where I'd say, no, it's certainly not true. We are still a very decent country with very decent instincts. So I think it's a mixed picture, but I think the thrust of your question is, can we please have a bit more of the good and a bit less of the bad? Which, who could disagree with that?
Kevin.
Kevin Tebbit, former colleague in various ways. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Kevin Tebbit, former colleague in various ways. Can you say a bit more about the quality of government crisis management and resilience planning today? Because I say that for two reasons. Firstly, you and I will remember around 2000, where we had the 4 Fs, floods, fuel, fire, and foot and mouth, where 4 crises happened in a very short period of time together, where getting on top of those crises, particularly foot and mouth, required the use very much of military planning, command and control systems, the ability to bring a lot of information together and begin to dominate a crisis in the same way that the military seek to dominate a military situation. John Speller here will know this only too well. And those lessons were taken into government at the time, particularly in the Cabinet Office crisis coordination system. Secondly, both of us have been in FTSE 100 companies for 12 years, and I've noticed how risk registers in the private sector moved in that period from being interesting lists of issues which were quite separate from the real business of the board to becoming integral to the way in which those companies operate, so that each month those risk registers actually have something to be said about them in terms of how the executives are running that business. For those two reasons, I wonder whether in government today we actually are as good as we were possibly 10, 15 years ago, and what you think about government risk register today, whether it's real or just a list which is diversionary, and whether some of those planning lessons we learned back from foot and mouth and all of that have tended to atrophy over time.
Great question. You obviously read the book.
Actually, I really haven't, but we did share some similar experiences.
Yeah. First thing, I think it's just worth registering a point I make in the book. We have a world-class doctrine, if you like, for how we manage the sudden impact crises. Its shorthand is COBRA, but there's a lot more to it than that. It's also the Gold Command system that was introduced after the Broadwater riots. So all the police forces, the emergency services, they're all, as it were, working off the same basic doctrine. The problem is, for resource reasons, we haven't been exercising it perhaps as vigorously as we should. The tragic events at the Manchester Arena, where command and control, the Gold Command, didn't appreciate what was actually happening fast enough. So the fire and rescue services were held miles outside and were not available to treat the casualties of the bombing because of the suspect. This is a terrorist attack, there may be other terrorists roaming and so on. The answer to that is training and exercising over and over again. So I think we know what to do. It will take more resource and time for the system to get back. In the book, I spend some time talking about 2012 and the London Olympics, which was probably the height of our preparedness and readiness. But that took years of effort, patient effort. Including, I remember sitting in Cobra, I was brought back from retirement to train everyone who was involved in every conceivable disaster, from the temperature being so hot that the railway lines buckled, to being too cold that cyber attacks, the terrorism, you name it. And it was a hugely successful event. Risk registers, when I was in the Cabinet Office, I got permission to publish the first government risk register, and its risk matrix, likelihood and impact if these things happen. It was a great step forward, but after 2007, of course, you look back and you say, greedy bankers were not on the risk register. Whereas actually, as a national risk, problems with the financial system, well, in the Bank of England, they knew all about that, and the Treasury knew all about that. But it wasn't on the risk register because it's not like the things that Kevin mentioned, floods and fire and foot and mouth. I think we've got over that now. Where my sense is a more sophisticated. For what it's worth, I put in the book advice for anyone who's chairing a risk committee or is involved in those sorts of discussions in either the public or the private sector, which is to carefully engineer the meeting so that it falls into 3 parts. And in the first part, you quiz the executive about their plans for all the things they can do nothing about. You know, collapse of the sterling, you know, the building next door blows up, or whatever it might be. They're out of their control. So what are their contingency plans? And Chief Executive, when was the last time you and your team rehearsed any of these plans? Those sort of questions. Needn't take very long. But the killer question is, when was the last time you actually tested this out? Then the second part are the risks, I think, Kevin, you may be referring to a lot of these, that are intrinsic in the nature of the business. So if the Ministry of Justice is running prisons, people will try and escape. What's the system for giving assurance to the Secretary of State for Justice that, you know, the television, CCTV cameras and the locks and so on all work? And in a financial sense, of course, what are the mechanisms for internal and external audit that give? Nicola Sturgeon is kind of running into this problem. What are the assurances that the finances are actually, you know, okay? But then the third part, which is where it really, in my experience, it really gets interesting, are the self-imposed risks. So the organisation didn't have to replace its entire IT system. It didn't have to relocate. You know, these are things which either the government or the company decided to do. And then you have a different discussion. It's just remind me, says the chair of the committee, who did we put in charge of that huge initiative? Because if it goes wrong, it will sink the company or the department, its reputation. Was it the best person, or was it just the person who happened to be around at the time? When was the last time we checked how they're getting on? Did we give them enough money? And that tends to tease out the slow burn crises that I was referring to. My dear old department, the Home Office, you know, would launch into enormous IT revolutions and then be horribly surprised when, you know, the price and cost had gone up, the timescale had gone up, and we'd failed perhaps to really allocate enough authority to the person in charge just to make damn sure it worked, because without that, we're in serious trouble. So I think there are things you can do to liven up, so it's not just a list of all the bad things that could happen, which would be a very long list.
I've got another online question from Mary Dejewski. In the cyber age, would it be possible to reverse an invasion of the Falkland Islands or similar without sending a task force halfway around the world?
Probably not. There's 2 parts to my answer. One is what it would pose, in that case for Margaret Thatcher, a very difficult question about, am I prepared to escalate onto the actual mainland of Argentina and switch off their lights, switch off their everything. You know, can we, GCHQ, please hack in and cause as much damage as possible? Technically, I suppose they could. These days, you could probably do a bit of that. It would extend the crisis, and she was very determined not to attack mainland Argentina. And when the crisis was over, we would have to have relationships and trading relationships with Argentina. A lot of British people lived in Argentina. So the policy implication of the question I'm not sure about. The other thing that's worth registering, and this is very relevant to Ukraine, is that if the wind's in your favour, you can do quite a lot of damage with cyber attacks. But you can't very often guarantee that A, it's going to work, and if it does work, it will have the effect that you intend. Because these are very complex systems running, say, the Ministry of Defence or the Armed Forces or the Argentine Navy. It would only take the tiniest little upgrade that you didn't know they'd made, and the attack wouldn't work. You'd press the button and nothing would happen. So as a way of distracting your opponent and of making their life a bit of misery, then the cyber means strikes me as ideally suited, particularly to an autocrat who doesn't much care that you're switching off the light support machines in hospitals. But as a kind of precision, we are definitely going to stop the 3 leading ships of the task force, the Argentine forces, because suddenly they'll discover the navigation doesn't work. I don't think you could rely on that. Who knows? I may be wrong. I'm not the deepest expert in this.
Man at the back.
James Kidner, formerly of the Foreign Office, then in the much more foreign world of technology. It's been a riveting presentation, and everyone must follow my example and buy the book. But a cursory browse of the chapter headings. This isn't meant as a criticism, but it's very much, as you'd expect, a top-down assessment of how officials and others can create a more resilient structure for the government to survive crises and indeed companies to do the same. Could you talk just a little bit about what I would call the sort of bottom-up exercises that we can do, building on Nigel's question, and John's in the front here, where society itself needs to be more resilient? This gets into sort of Robert Putnam territory about bowling alone and how you can look to society to be more robust. I know that Elizabeth Braw's done some work on this. I know that there is talk about how it can be integrated better, as the Ukrainians have done magnificently over the last year or so, to get all of society pulling in the same direction, rather than, as we are rather at the moment, pulling in opposite ones.
Yeah, fabulous question. I got permission from the Swedish MSB, their civil defence organisation, to take a page from the booklet they sent out to every household in Sweden, which is basically, what would you do if your life was turned upside down and, for example, we were in a war? Basic advice. And so I've taken a page of that, and it's in the back of the book. Things that a household could do and discuss as a family, preparations you might make, and so on. Because the thrust of your question is right, and I do say this in the book, that every crisis is in the end local. It's real people that get hurt in real places. And in the end, when there's a flood, somebody has to relocate the people who are displaced. Somebody has to give them fresh clothing, which in a terrorist attack may have been blown off them. Somebody has to cut the sandwiches in the village hall, which has been taken over as the reception centre for the survivors. We're very blessed with a charitable sector in this country. Some church-related, others not. But in comparison, say, with France or Germany, we have a much stronger local sector. But what we have hollowed out is local government. And the cuts on local government have removed huge chunks of our capacity to plan at a very local level. The emergency planning sort of network and society. The Cabinet Office still runs an emergency planning college. It's actually run by Serco, and it's not what it was. It used to have Europe's finest library of raw material on past crises and what to do with it. It doesn't anymore. I'm afraid the relentless, do more with less mantra. So one of the first things I would do is indeed to start to build back at a local level. The military have a strong part to play in the local resilience forum. And MOD has said it will work on that, so that's positive. And I'd give a shout out to one of your frequent attendees who sent me an email to say sadly he couldn't make it, which is Lord Toby Harris, who is chairing the National Preparedness Commission and has done a huge amount of work from his experience in London looking at that kind of local preparedness. But Ukraine is so positive, the self-help and mutual help. And some of the tools are, again, we had a test quite recently of our national alert system. I don't know if your mobile phone rang, Michael, mine did.
Mine did too, yes.
So that's the population, the capacity to tell the population that something bad has happened. From that, with a bit of money, you've got the capacity to tell parts of the population that are affected what's happening. I cited Grenfell Tower. It would have been technically possible with that technology for everyone in that tower who had a mobile phone, which I guarantee is over 90%, to have been sent a message by the fire chief in charge of the fire ground saying, ignore previous messages to hold on and stay tight, get out now. And the same would be true in the Twin Towers, because the best advice in most circumstances is shut the door and stay and wait for rescue. That's not the best advice in the particulars, but no way of communicating with the people in the building. So I think, if we were really imaginative and we put compare with government spending, this is peanuts. You could make a real difference to our resilience.
I can take two questions together, if I may, because we're coming towards the end. The lady in yellow. Thank you. Behind you.
Misha Madvani from Uganda High Commission. I'm the Uganda High Commissioner here in London. Yeah. So just fairly simple. It's related to another question that you had. Cyber walls for security, are they really as effective as they're made out to be? Because you've got drones, you've got Siri, you've got Google, everything listens to everything all the time. So companies, State Department, Foreign Office, intelligence, etc., etc. Just wanted to understand that, please.
And the gentleman in the corner.
Thank you very much. Noel Hedge-Michael from the Defence and Security Circle at the club here. In an era of modern deterrence or hybrid warfare, is decoupling from China a huge slow burn?
Can I take those two?
Yeah. How long have we got? The cyber war question is a very good one. My colleague, a former colleague at King's College, Thomas Ridd, actually published a book called Cyber War Will Not Happen, by which he didn't mean there won't be destructive cyber attacks, but what he meant was that the moment those cyber attacks get to a level of distraction where people are dying, then it's not going to stay in cyberspace. So if you have the mental image of America and Russia, or America and China, simply slogging it out in cyberspace, only the machines get hurt. Thomas's view was forget it. Flights of cruise missiles will be going through the air, when there are a lot of people dead through these sorts of attacks. So it's not cyber war, it's war with cyber added in. And I can't imagine any future conflict where both sides are desperately trying to use cyber means to slow down the other and disable them. Distraction of government this is part of hybrid warfare, just at the moment when you want the Cabinet or the National Security Council deeply focused, they will have to divert because, you know, a diversionary attack, you know, cyberspace. I just think about WannaCry. Northern Ireland's health service was basically put out of action. Now, thankfully, this young man found the kill switch for WannaCry, so it didn't spread. But if he hadn't, that really would have been extremely. That was North Korea. I mean, the North Koreans are paying for their nuclear program by stealing our money. I mean, the latest attacks on Bitcoin exchanges, you know, 120 billion just dollars worth just disappeared. So, you know, I don't want to be read as minimizing the cyber threat. I'm quite the opposite. I think it's really, really serious. But you've got to set it in whatever context, whether it's grand theft, grand larceny, or whether it's one state trying to get an advantage over another state, or whether it's just, you know, an adjunct to warfare. And these are all slightly different. Decoupling, you saw what happened with the slogan. So decoupling is now no longer official terminology. The G7 picked up on the American phrase of de-risking. It's not a bad idea. You don't want to discover, if you're Apple Corporation, you don't want to discover you're completely dependent on manufacturing facilities in China. Unfortunately for the advanced stuff, the 2 and 3 nanometer chips, there is only one place, and that's Taiwan, that is capable of making. Using machines where there's only one supplier in the Netherlands. At something like $350 million ago. So these are expensive machines, and it appears that the skill required to actually get these things to work is such that there are only a handful of people who can actually do it there in Taiwan at the moment. The United States is spending an enormous amount of money setting up a parallel plant in Arizona with the help of TSMC. But TSMC is complaining there aren't any technicians, as it were, good enough to actually make it work. I mean, this is really fascinating, because if the Chinese, if President, we're off the record, are we off the record? I don't know. If President Xi were to think that by taking offensive military action against Taiwan, he could capture the island, and therefore capture this jewel in the crown of future technology, somebody needs to slip him a message. It wouldn't be like that. The few dozen skilled technicians would be on a fast plane to the United States, and I suspect the $350 million machine wouldn't be working.
Well, sadly now we've come to the end of our time. I have to always finish it at 2 o'clock because that's one of the assurances that I give. I'm running 2 minutes over, but I think we've had an absolutely fascinating session. I've certainly got a lot more questions I'd like to ask you. We might find another forum for doing so, but I'm sure you've had the same experience as me, and I'd like you to thank our guest in the usual way.